Welcome back. You're watching World News, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. We start with the peace negotiations in Saudi Arabia, which are now underway. Senior American and Russian officials are holding talks on negotiating an end to the Russian war in Ukraine. This marks the most significant meeting between the two sides since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine nearly 3 years ago. The United States is represented in the Saudi Arabian capital by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Donald Trump's Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. They're discussing possible solutions to the war in Ukraine with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin's Foreign Affairs Advisor Yury Ushakov, and the head of Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, Kirill Dmitriev. According to Russian authorities, the meeting is purely bilateral and will not include Ukrainian officials. The talks mark another step by the Trump administration to reverse Joe Biden's policy of isolating Russia. They're also intended to pave the way for a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Today's talks with the American delegation are extremely important, and the whole world is watching to see if the US and Russia can improve their relations, because our better relations will allow us to solve many global tasks and problems that the world is currently facing. We see that economic cooperation is also important. I will be responsible for the economic aspect of the discussion. The figure that we are voicing for the first time now is that American businesses have lost more than $300 billion by leaving the Russian market.
The meetings in Riyadh are taking place without the presence of Ukrainian officials, which had sparked fierce responses not only across the world, but most importantly in Ukraine. Our correspondent Oz Kataji is in Kyiv monitoring reactions to the peace negotiations in Saudi Arabia. So Oz, what's the Ukrainian capital saying about the talks between American and Russian delegations in Riyadh?
Well, President Zelensky's obviously said that he will not recognize any agreements made that do not include Ukraine. And Ukraine says they haven't had the relevant discussions with their strategic partners necessary to begin any kind of agreements, let alone, come to any sorts of conclusions about them. So obviously, Ukraine is not happy with developments as they are ongoing. However, Zelensky himself has been relatively positive in talking about his discussions with Donald Trump. So I think the attitude so far is to wait and see rather than trying to go in and antagonize Donald Trump now. Because, look, even if they are talking, the US and Russia are still a long way off any kinds of agreements. And, if the US wants to achieve any kind of agreement, it will require concessions being made. So far, the Russians are very obviously and clearly saying they are not making concessions, and the Ukrainians are saying the same thing. So, look, they are talking. This is not something that's making the Ukrainian side happy. They would rather be consulted first rather than the other way around. But there is still no agreement, either in theory or on paper. And until more details emerge, Ukraine is probably just going to wait and see before it decides to react in any official manner.
Thank you so much. That was Oz Kataji coming to us live from Kyiv. The day after the summit in Paris, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk took to social media to emphasize his priorities on the issue of Ukraine, guided first and foremost by the security of Poland.
Neither polling data nor suggestions from frenzied commentators will influence my decisions regarding Ukraine. Poland's security will remain the sole guiding principle here. This is what the efforts of our government and our diplomatic corps are aimed at, efforts carried out in cooperation with our allies and Ukraine.
Donald Trump's special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Kellogg, is scheduled to visit Warsaw this afternoon and meet with President Andrzej Duda. Before leaving for Poland, Kellogg met with two top representatives of the European Union in Brussels. We now go live to our EU correspondent, Angela Skujins. So, hello, Angela. What do we know so far about those two meetings?
So we know that the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was the first of the EU executive to meet Keith Kellogg, that is the US Special Representative for Ukraine and Russia. And according to a readout which came in mere hours ago, she pressed upon her Washington counterpart that the EU wants to partner with the US to deliver a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. This has been a major message coming out of Brussels, that the EU wants a seat at the table when these ceasefire negotiations occur to ensure that peace for the continent is there. We also know European Council President Antonio Costa also released a press release mere half an hour ago where he said that peace cannot be a simple ceasefire. This is a line being once again delivered from Brussels, where the executive is pressing upon Washington to be a part of these ceasefire talks. Now, both of these meetings were postponed as those leaders were in the French capital yesterday among roughly 11 European leaders. The aim was to hammer out a continental response to these negotiation talks. But Keith Kellogg is scheduled to visit Poland today, so wait and see what comes out of those meetings.
Thank you so much. That was Angela Skujins reporting from Brussels. And we remain in Brussels. Security is a common good, therefore it needs a common European answer, said Polish Finance Minister Andrzej Domański ahead of the Economic and Financial Affairs Council meeting, which he's chairing. The bloc's finance and economy ministers are meeting to discuss the economic and financial impact of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. They will also debate the EU budget as well as recovery and resilience plans, among other pressing issues.
We definitely need to focus on the European solution. We need to, we believe that security is a common good, therefore we need a common European answer. This is why we will also try to convince our European partners to spend more on defense and also to create a strong European defense industry.
Warsaw Mayor and Polish presidential candidate Rafał Trzaskowski is visiting Helsinki today. In the Finnish capital, the Polish official met with President Alexander Stubb and Finland's Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen. Representatives of Warsaw Municipal Security Center and City Guard are also in Helsinki to discuss security matters with their Finnish counterparts. Trzaskowski discussed issues related to security and civil defense. The meeting marks a continuation of security talks that began at the Munich Security Conference. His visit to Finland is also an opportunity to exchange experiences in protecting residents of major cities. As stated by Trzaskowski's office, Warsaw is a prime example of how local governments can lead in crisis management, beginning with humanitarian aid and ending on improvements in the area of civil defense. It's too early to talk about sending Lithuanian troops as peacekeeping forces to Ukraine, as nothing is known about the ceasefire and eventual peace plan yet. That's according to the Speaker of the Lithuanian Parliament, Saulius Skvernelis.
I think today is too early to talk. There's nothing to talk about. We neither know the format of the negotiations nor the kind of peace that is to be sought, because we see statements that are very different, from essentially capitulation to seeking a formula for just peace. I think it's far too early to talk about this. When we truly see that Ukrainian interests are properly represented, and if there is such a need, then Lithuania will consider it. But now there's no point talking about it.
Volodymyr Zelensky is meeting with Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Ankara today. The meeting is held at the invitation of the Turkish president, according to the newspaper Ukraińska Prawda. Zelensky's visit to Turkey was announced during the Munich Security Conference. The leaders of Ukraine and Turkey are set to discuss bilateral relations of both countries, including the revision of their strategic partnership. Further strengthening of the relations between Ankara and Kyiv is also on the agenda, as are recent developments in Ukraine. Russia launched a wave of drone attacks against Kyiv overnight. While the country's capital was shaken by a series of explosions, no casualties were reported.
The attacks targeted the northern parts of the city, but the incoming UAVs were engaged by Ukrainian air defense units. Debris from one Russian drone reportedly fell in a non-residential district of Kyiv, sparking a fire at a warehouse and setting nearby cars ablaze.
All 80 passengers and crew on board a plane that crash-landed before flipping over at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada survived the disaster.
All 80 passengers and crew on board a plane that crash-landed before flipping over at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada survived the disaster. Emergency services said 18 people were injured, 3 of them critically, when the aircraft overturned as it touched down in windy conditions on Monday afternoon local time. US carrier Delta said the flight from Minneapolis was operated by its Endeavour Air subsidiary. It had 76 passengers and 4 crew members on board. Airport officials said earlier on Monday that the facility was dealing with high winds and freezing temperatures as airlines attempted to catch up with missed flights after a weekend snowstorm. Canadian authorities have launched an investigation into the cause of the crash.
This marks the end of our news service, but please do stay tuned back here on TVP World in just a moment with more news and features.